All right. Wow. Thanks. We're a small startup, and this means a lot to have so many people here listening to a bit of a story that I'm going to tell you. It's going to be a little bit different, I think, than some of the other presentations. So bear with me. First of all, just a little bit about us. We focus on workflow automation for development teams. What we offer is what we think of as a shared command line for your development team that lets them automate tasks. And we really focus on like two core tenets of this, which is the first one is how simple can we make the developer experience? How much can we abstract away complexity so as you're out there hiring developers, they can spend more time delivering code and not wrangling complexity? And the second thing is how do you create intelligence from automation that can give you operational insight into your business? So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. Before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about me because it'll help frame why I look at the world the way I do. The first thing you should know about me is I'm self-taught in everything that I've done, whether it's as an entrepreneur, as an engineer. And the second thing is that I started my career way back when shared hosting was a big deal. So I helped worked at a company called Hostopia that had products like Easy Site Wizard. And I spent a lot of time on the front end of the stack as well as the back end stack. So user experience has always been really important to me. And over the last maybe like 5 years, I've helped 25 different startups implement different kinds of DevOps strategies to help them compete for talent and also upskill the talent that they have in their organizations. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I learned about it, but I want to make sure that I set my position clear on DevOps and take it from, of course, AWS, which is the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, tools that increase an organization's ability to deliver applications at a high velocity. So what I've learned working with all these startups is that a lot of times these DevOps tools can feel like literally a snake swallowing an elephant. There's a lot of complexity, and as engineers are being hired into an organization, you can actually have a diminishing return in velocity if you can't hire in the senior talent you need to offset the emerging talent that you have access to or are competing for in the market. So after working with all of these startups and doing a lot of research on this, came to learn that about 300 billion is actually lost every year in developer productivity. And according to the Stripe coefficient, it's a bigger threat than access to capital for most businesses. And I know, and I'm sure most people in this room know that, we all recognize the importance of automation, but it's hard to reprioritize your senior talent around it sometimes when you have business deliverables and timelines. So I really thought about this a lot, and I asked myself, how could I solve this problem? And is there an opportunity here? Is obviously a big challenge. And what is the greatest yield that's left in the DevOps stack? And I truly believe it's the user experience. So I did what any engineer would do, and I asked my mom. I started talking to my mom about it. And the reason I did is because we bat ideas around a lot. She is not a developer, for the record. Well, she we'll get to there. But she is somebody who went through a job transition a little while ago, and maybe knowledge work was an opportunity for her. And I asked myself, I was like, what could we do if we needed to actually have my mom join your engineering team and be successful? And this is somebody who doesn't understand DevOps whatsoever. So what would it need to look like? It need to have a simple and intuitive experience. We'd need to codify the best practices so that she didn't have to think so much about the complexity that she was dealing with. She'd have to follow the dotted lines rather than have to connect dots between multi-cloud and multi-SaaS and all this stuff that's so prevalent here. And I would need to enable her to access critical processes, but absolutely minimize any risk from her having gaps in her knowledge, essentially. So we decided to run some experiments with my mom, and I'm going to run you through 3 of them real quick. So the first is that she's never used GitHub. I showed her DOS once, and that's pretty much like all she knows. But like she's pretty confident at this point. So we walked through it, and basically that's what we're going to walk through today is 3 different experiments. So the first was we broke down a typical developer workflow as it relates to something like GitHub. And we said, okay, what would it need to look like if we broke this down into a set of stages, a set of workflows, where not only could we streamline it for her intuitiveness, but also start to collect workflow information so that over time she could see her productivity increase and she'd have a reinforcement loop that she could learn from. And this is sort of how we broke it down. As you'll see on the left-hand side here, Ops Run Mom, this is sort of a call out to our platform where we help build these shared command line tools, but we broke it down into a series of steps. And I'm going to show you the first one. So the first one is I gave her a crash course in a modern CLI, and I gave her this version of the CLI with these commands. And that sort of represents this first step that we're going to walk her through. So good, my animations work. So this is just basically an example of how the interactive user experience can guide her through the process of creating a repository without noting what a repository is, selecting the organization, creating that repository so that she can get started creating code. I mean, we've all seen these sort of intuitive, interactive kinds of inputs before. The next step is she needs to be able to put labels so that she can manage her work. So same thing, created a bit of a workflow around managing labels so that she's not clicking around, synchronizing labels across all of her repositories. She can basically select from a list, synchronize that label across all of her repositories, and get started working. So from there, she needs to create an issue to define what she's going to work on. So same thing. You're starting to see a pattern here. So once we start to put these things on Rails, it becomes really easy to train anybody around what that experience needs to look like. And there's an inherent yield that we were able to start calculating in that. So I'm just going to skip through the last few of these kind of a little bit faster because they're a little bit longer running animations. And I think by now you kind of get the idea of what I'm going for here. We go to the next one. She needs to select the issue that she's going to work on and start working on it. This is where we start running into issues with things like Git and branching. She really did not understand what a branch was. So we streamlined this process right through fetching, rebasing the code, grabbing and converting things into a pull request. And we'll skip through it a little bit more quickly here because we don't need to see application generators necessarily. But at the end of this day here, she was actually able to get to a place where she could save her work, merge her work in, and effectively then we had all of this information that we could use to assess what was the actual cycle, how many tasks did she be able to streamline. And what we concluded is that she was able to take about 10 minutes to be able to actually contribute code. And we took 34 steps down to 6. The way that we try to represent this, like from a cultural standpoint within an engineering org, is we kind of have a rule in our team: everybody commits code, everyone deploys on day one. And what that does is it creates a sort of a cultural value that says we prioritize ease of use and helping people ramp up and level up into our tool chain as quickly as possible. So what did I learn? I learned that a CLI is a great tool for anyone to be able to streamline. It's especially helpful for anyone who doesn't have as much experience. You can streamline your decision making, and people can contribute really quickly in your organization. Now that means that you can ramp people up and up-level them very quickly into complex tasks. Now this wasn't that complex relatively to the people in this room, but relative to the person who was going through it, it very much was. And more importantly, it meant that I was able to remove blockers so that she wasn't calling me on the phone every 5 minutes asking me to fix the problem. So she's feeling pretty confident at this point. So we're going on to step 2. We'll level it up a little bit. So this time we came up with a kind of a fun one where we wanted to incorporate some AWS services, grab a repo, generate some images, create an S3 bucket, and deploy a customized image to an S3 bucket. And this is kind of what it would look like, more of a linear workflow, not so many steps. We wanted to see if we could cut it down to basically like one command where she could achieve a lot of different things. So this is what it looked like when we defined it. It was just sort of like a YML like you'd see in Travis CI. Once we built it, it ran the different steps within the process. As you can see, they're components. And there was environment variables that could be sourced on her behalf, so she didn't even have to deal with bash environment variables. So essentially, this is what it turned out. And as it worked through, what happened is it got to a third step. We coded it so that she just basically had to provide one input, and everything else was taken care of for her in the process. And here we go, mom. And what we should have at the end of this quick example is an S3 bucket with a pirate flag that says mom on it. And we do. So this was really quick, 43 seconds. I'm not actually sure how long this would take if I had to ask my mom to do it from scratch. Probably would have took a while. But either way, it was like another great way of being able to streamline developer productivity for less experienced people. So I learned that from this that if you have a single command, what's really great about that is being able to chain that into many commands. Now power users can have their cake and eat it too. So somebody who didn't necessarily want that sort of simplified experience could pull it out and draw on it. So modularity is really important in a developer experience. The other thing is that when we condense these into one step, it greatly improved the productivity, obviously. And I think at the end of the day, what I realized is like the amount of time I could save somebody is really relative to the user experience, because I think this had probably the highest yield of all of the experiences, but we'll see. So she's pretty good and starting to give me some grief at this point along the way. So instead of deploying on Fridays, I challenged her to create a Kubernetes cluster. And this was one where I was really excited about it because finally I could stretch my muscle a little bit and show her something interesting. So we sort of started looking at how could we create a Kubernetes cluster, what would that look like, what would be the decision-making criteria that she'd need to make if we streamlined it. And we kind of started on the technical side, of course, and we mapped it out. And so what we have here is a fairly typical internet gateway into a VPC with 3 different zones that have public and private subnets. And then a VPC peering with a virtual private cloud is where the databases are set up. At this point, she had no idea what I was talking about, but we started to go through the experiment anyway. And this is sort of how we mapped out the different steps. So obviously, this isn't something that we were going to build from the ground up. We were going to stand on the shoulders of giants just like anyone else. And there's a lot of really great tools out there that you can use and leverage to streamline the tooling that you offer. Anything from COPS, kubectl, Ansible. I mean, there's sort of a whole gamut of things here. And what was really important about this is that, there was no way that she was going to be able to learn one of these, let alone 10 of these. And what I realized is as each one of these new tools became a part of the component, the overhead to success got way higher and higher and higher. So this was a bit of a challenge. So we ended up coming up with a CLI, still a very simple interface. And at the end of the day, as it runs through here, you'll see that it has some decision-making criteria. There was definitely some education needed here, so we linked docs where possible, although I'm not sure that was helpful to her, but it would be helpful to somebody who's ramping up on a developer experience. Another tip, insert education along the way. And essentially, the process of going through and actually selecting from pick lists or selected lists and being able to just do raw inputs meant that we could streamline this down quite far. The second process was that once the Kubernetes cluster was online, well, you have to run something in it. So we were actually able to give there a process where you could select from a couple of core default services to deploy into the Kubernetes cluster. And at the end of the day, that allowed, after about 15 minutes of sort of computing, for there to be a Kubernetes cluster. And a bit of a validation on the cluster. And there you go, Grafana and Kibana. I mean, I'm not sure that's anything particularly useful for her on that cluster, but she at least had some real applications deployed on it. So at that point, we brought 16 steps down into one step. And I think that was really helpful for her productivity. So last lesson. So what did I learn along this experiment? I learned that Kubernetes is really complex, even for me, and I've been doing this a long time. I think it's not necessarily always the best tool for everyone, but I think it's definitely what's in fashion right now, and it's a very useful tool. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's kind of like a kernel for the cloud, and not everybody needs to start there. And I think that was a big lesson for us, is that some of the tools you decide to use along the way, you have to rely on their intuitiveness in order to actually create productivity in your organization. And as that's happening, I think of it as like intuition drift. So every tool you bring in, every module you bring into your organization can actually have a pretty substantial impact on how your team delivers software. And at the end of the day, it's really a promising world that we're living in. So I think there's a lot to be done here around building user experiences on top of things like Kubernetes, the cloud providers, or even CI/CD. That's going to be really promising. So DevOps Hero, my mom made it. So I'm just going to run through a really quick live demo of a new feature that we've kind of put together here. If this will work. All right, here we go. So the last thing that we decided to do, and this kind of happened after I put the talk together, is we decided to make it so that all of these sort of command line interfaces could also run in Slack, because obviously like that question and answer style interaction, very representative of chat ops. And so that's where we sort of came up with something. So I'm not going to run through the whole demo, but I am just going to sort of show a similar kind of model here where on the right-hand side, what we have is a microservice that I've deployed to that cluster. There's about 6 microservices. On the left-hand side, I've got my Slack window. I'm going to initiate a workflow using the exact same command I did on the terminal. These commands are polymorphic, so they can run in both places. And what was interesting here and what we did is we started to come up with ways to sort of actually streamline credential management as well. So you can select your secrets from a vault in the back end. And that's one more thing that we were able to get out of the way here as far as customizing this microservice and deploying it. So I'm just going to deploy this application to demo 3, which is the microservice we're talking about. We'll just go with something nice like yo. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to generate some code. It's going to check it into GitHub, create an ECR image with code build. And after it's done, then I would be able to, I'll switch to the terminal and I'll just quickly deploy it to this microservice. So as you can see here, on the link that we've put here, you can see just some customized code that's been checked in. That's been checked into the GitHub repository that changes some HTML, some CSS. We'll also click in here to the code build, which is probably the most time-consuming process of this demo. What you can see is the phases are now building, and here in about, we'll say, 15 seconds, it should complete the build, and Slack should then tell me that my image has been deployed to the ECR registry, and I can now go manually deploy it. I obviously could do this in one step, and it's kind of like treating Slack like a CI/CD server. But really what we're doing here is we're leveraging a number of different tools. And I think the future of DevOps is inherently like going to incorporate pretty much every piece of software that you see out there on the floor right now. And again, like I was saying earlier, every new tool that you bring in can make tooling more complex for your team. So what we really like about this is we have sort of an abstraction layer on top of all of that tools and all that complexity that can make it relatively simple for a developer to just focus on the thing that they need to accomplish. And when they do that, that means that they're going to be more productive, and more of their time is going to be spent shipping features that, frankly, businesses, customers love. And I think that's a really important part of what we're trying to solve with this big challenge, which we call the talent gap, because we all know it's really hard to hire and motivate and upskill talent. So I'll just complete this and I'll switch over. We'll deploy this image. Yes. And in about 1 second here, we should have an updated microservice. There we go. It worked. Cool. So our goal is really to make everyone what we think of as a DevOps hero by simplifying complex tasks. And if there's anything that I can ask you to try to take away from this talk, it's there's going to need to be about 60 million new developers that come online in the next 10 years. And they're going to need onboarding, and the people in this room are the people who are building the tools that they will use. And the DevOps experience that we currently have, I think it needs a lot of work. I think it isn't as intuitive as it could be. It's very powerful, but it could be more intuitive. I don't think it needs to be so hard all the time. I think sometimes we like it to be hard, and I think we should think a lot more about how to simplify the DevOps tool chain. I also think that it's our responsibility to build tools that help others who come after us to avoid the complexity that we learned, because For example, I have a young son who I know in 10 years is not going to know anything about Kubernetes. And so if I don't pass that knowledge down somehow through codified tools, I think it's really important. And open source does a lot, but we have to do a lot in businesses as well. And I think if we all kind of focus on that, we can put the dev back into DevOps. So that's it for me. 9 seconds left and right on time. Thanks, everybody. Come see us at booth 310, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. We've also got people with CTO.ai shirts who would love to chat with you.